think about those places in our society, the ones operating almost totally out of sight, places holding hundreds of thousands of people, reflecting some pretty intense realities. Today, we're doing a deep dive into one of those maximum security prisons. What's really happening behind those walls? It's a question I think many of us have probably wondered about. And our goal here is just to bring some clarity and maybe peel back a layer or two on that often hidden world.
Absolutely. And these facilities, well, they're where the system puts individuals considered the most dangerous, the highest security risk. The main aim, obviously, is protecting society. And, rehabilitation gets mentioned, but the environment itself, it throws up some pretty big hurdles to that goal, as we'll probably get into.
Yeah, the scale is it's huge. When you look at the numbers, 2024 figures from the Bureau of Justice Statistics show over 2.1 million people incarcerated in the U.S. overall. And a big slice of that, around 420,000, maybe 20%, are in maximum security. Places like ADX Florence in Colorado or Pelican Bay out in California. People have heard the names. They have this almost legendary, definitely very private reputation.
Right, and that mystery makes sense, given, their purpose and the security level. But it's key to remember, inside those walls, there's still communities. Very controlled ones, sure, but grappling with these immense internal pressures. You mentioned that dual-purpose safety and rehabilitation right there. That creates a tension, doesn't it? How do you actually foster change in a place that's mainly about maximum control?
Exactly. And I think that's where our usual picture might not quite capture it. You imagine these impenetrable fortresses, right? But the reality often includes, well, significant overcrowding, chronic underfunding, and frankly, alarmingly high levels of violence. So that's what we want to unpack in this deep dive. These really complex challenges, like how overcrowding affects everything, the deep mental health issues that seem so widespread, the constant threat of violence, and just the profound impact of isolation.
Yeah, and it's crucial, I think, to also get a feel for the day-to-day life. What's the routine actually like for people inside? How do interactions with staff and other inmates play out? And maybe most critically, what's the psychological toll? What does this environment do to a person over time?
We also, in looking into this, came across a really powerful story, the journey of a former inmate, Jamal Carter. It's a story about transformation, about the potential for redemption, really. And it highlights why talking about reforms is just so vital. So, yeah, the mission today is pretty straightforward. Peel back those layers, get past the headlines, and really confront the tough realities shaping lives inside and ultimately outside these walls.
Okay, so where do we even start? What are some of the biggest, maybe the most pressing challenges facing these places right now?
Well, a huge one, maybe like a foundational issue that just makes everything else worse, is simple overcrowding. When you squeeze too many people into spaces not built for them, it just kicks off this whole chain reaction of
It
problems.
seems almost backward, doesn't it? You'd think security is paramount, but overcrowding sounds like it actively undermines that. Our sources for 2024 suggest something like 60% of U.S. max security facilities are operating over capacity. 60%. And Pelican Bay, you mentioned them, apparently housed up to 150% of its design capacity at points. I mean, can you even picture the impact of that? Oh, it has a very real, very tangible effect on daily life. Imagine sharing a tiny cell, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with someone else, maybe more than one of them. Just the sheer lack of personal space creates this constant immense stress. And, a 2023 study from the Vera Institute of Justice actually linked overcrowding directly to a 25% jump in violent incidents. It's a pressure cooker.
That makes total sense. Constant close quarters, competing for basics, tensions have to boil over. And it's not just physical fights, right? The Marshall Project quoted a former inmate in 2024 saying it was like being packed in like sardines, always on edge, waiting for the next fight. That feeling, that constant hypervigilance, it must be incredibly draining.
Absolutely. The psychological weight of that relentless pressure, you just can't overestimate it. It fuels anxiety, aggression, this pervasive sense of instability. And it's within that context, that extreme density, that other huge issues like mental health become even more critical.
Which takes us right to what some call a silent epidemic inside these walls, the mental health crisis. The numbers are, frankly, alarming. NAMI estimates something like 55% of inmates in these places have a diagnosable mental health condition. 55%. But here's the really tough part. Only about 1 in 3 of those people actually get any kind of treatment. Why? Why is that gap so huge?
That's a vital question. And what's striking is how the prison environment itself seems to, well, interact with and worsen existing conditions.
Yeah.
The isolation that's inherent in being incarcerated, the constant threat of violence, we just talked about these things, can dramatically worsen depression, anxiety, even more severe illnesses. And then you layer on top of that the practice of solitary confinement, which, while sometimes argued as necessary for security, has utterly devastating psychological effects.
Solitary confinement. Yeah.
Right.
Just the idea of 23 hours a day in a cell, often windowless, it's chilling. And the effects are apparently as bad as you'd fear. Sources talk about hallucinations, paranoia, and tragically, suicidal thoughts. An APA study from 2024 found that a shocking 66% of inmates held in solitary for over a year developed psychosis symptoms, and sometimes those effects were permanent.
It really raises huge ethical questions, doesn't it, about using practices like that, especially when we know the rates of mental illness are already so high in this population. And like you said, the severe lack of resources just pours gasoline on this fire.
Ah.
Budget cuts have hit mental health staffing hard in corrections.
Right. The national average is apparently just one mental health professional for every 150 inmates,
Right.
according to BJS data. That ratio is it's incredibly high. It basically guarantees most inmates struggling won't get the adequate care they need.
And if you connect the dots, the consequences are dire. Untreated mental illness often leads to more self-harm and, tragically, suicide. The 2024 Prison Policy Initiative report showed suicide rates in maximum security are 5 times higher than in the general population. 5 times. That's a profound human tragedy, and it says so much about the level of despair inside.
And it's not just the inmates, is it? The emotional burden on staff trying to manage these crises, often without enough support, that must be immense. Burnout, secondary trauma. It really paints this picture of a system just straining at the seams. And it feels like a lot of that strain traces back to one fundamental thing: underfunding.
Precisely. Underfunding really does seem to be a root cause for so many of these challenges. When state budgets or corrections get slashed, which has happened in many places, the whole system feels it.
Yeah, the numbers are stark. Sources suggest that in 2024, the average annual spending per inmate was around $55,000. Now, that might sound like a lot, but adjusted for inflation, it's actually a 10% decrease from 2015, according to the Vera Institute. And those cuts have very real, very physical consequences inside the prisons.
Exactly. You see it in crumbling infrastructure, leaking roofs, broken plumbing, even security systems malfunctioning. Believe it or not, even a place like ADX Florence, with its supermax reputation, has reportedly faced these kinds of basic maintenance issues. But it goes way beyond the buildings. Essential services like healthcare, education programs, they're often first on the chopping block when money gets tight.
There's a specific example, right? A 2023 audit of Sing Sing in New York found only about 15% of inmates could access vocational training because of budget limits. That just seems like a massive own goal for rehabilitation, doesn't it? If people can't learn skills, how are they supposed to succeed when they get out?
Exactly. And another direct hit from underfunding is staff shortages. We touched on it, but the turnover rate for correctional officers is sky high, 38% in 2024, per the U.S. DOJ. An average salary around $45,000 for a job that's incredibly stressful, often dangerous. It's just not enough to keep people in those roles.
And that just creates this vicious cycle, right? Understaffing makes things more dangerous, which burns out the staff who are there, making it even harder to hire replacements. It feels like the system is just constantly playing catch up.
It is. And in that environment, overcrowded, struggling with mental health, chronically underfunded, it's almost inevitable that violence and the influence of prison gangs will unfortunately thrive.
Yeah, violence seems like such a pervasive part of life inside, often described almost like a survival tool, a way to assert some power when you have none. The 2024 BJS stats are grim. 18,000 reported inmate-on-inmate assaults in max security. That's a 15% increase in just 1 year.
And what's really striking is the role gangs play. The National Gang Intelligence Center estimated in 2024 that maybe 30% of inmates affiliate with groups like the Aryan Brotherhood or MS-13. For many, it's seen as, well, a necessary form of protection in a really dangerous world.
But like you said earlier, that protection comes at a steep cost. Gang rivalries fuel so much of the violence, stabbings, beatings, even murders. That 2023 riot at San Quentin, reportedly sparked by gang tensions, resulted in, 12 deaths and dozens injured? It just shows how deadly serious this is.
And this pervasive culture of fear, it affects everyone, not just the inmates, but the staff too. We saw stats showing 10,000 reported assaults on staff in 2024. That's a huge number, and it speaks volumes about the dangers they face daily.
It must take an incredible emotional toll on officers. That APA study found PTSD rates among correctional officers are way higher than the general population. It's clearly a job with a heavy psychological weight.
Definitely. And for the inmates living under that constant threat, the psychological trauma can be profound, long-lasting. It makes existing mental health issues worse and severely hampers any chance at rehabilitation.
Yeah.
I mean, how can you focus on changing your life when your main focus is just making it through the day without getting hurt?
It paints a really bleak picture of the challenges. So, okay, with all that as the backdrop, what does a typical day even look like for someone in max security? It's hard to wrap your head around that kind of regimented life.
You're right. It's a world completely removed from the choices and freedoms most of us just take for granted. Daily life inside is defined by this almost suffocating routine. And that routine, its main purpose, is just maintaining order, minimizing conflict opportunities.
Sources give an example schedule, maybe like from ADX Florence guidelines. Wake up at 6 a.m., quick breakfast, then work or just cell time for hours, lunch, maybe 1 hour for exercise, then lockdown by 9 p.m. It sounds incredibly monotonous.
It is. And even basic things, like meals, become sources of frustration. Food, often described as repetitive, low quality, leads to a lot of dissatisfaction. And the mandatory work assignments, they provide some structure maybe, but pay practically nothing. Pennies an hour for often tedious work that understandably breeds resentment.
And that single hour of exercise, often in a caged outdoor area, even that small bit of freedom is apparently often overshadowed by gang tensions or security issues. It feels like every part of the day is constrained.
Well, and it's interesting that routine has this dual nature, right? On one hand, yes, it provides predictability in a potentially chaotic place. But on the other, it strips away almost all personal autonomy, all choice, which contributes massively to that feeling of dehumanization we talked about. That quote from the former Pelican Bay inmate, "You're a robot, same thing every day, no freedom, no choice, it breaks you down." That really captures it, I think.
It really does.
Yeah.
And inside that tightly controlled world, the interactions between guards and inmates must be incredibly tense, complex. It's a dynamic built on a huge power imbalance, and it sounds like a lot of mutual mistrust.
Absolutely. The guards have this incredibly tough job, maintain order in a very challenging setting. They're constantly balancing authority with trying to de-escalate things. But like that Vera Institute survey showed, a big majority of inmates feel they're treated disrespectfully, which just fuels more friction, you know?
And inmates are doing their own balancing act, aren't they? Cooperate to avoid trouble, or resist, which might affect their standing with peers, especially if gangs are involved.
Exactly. And the stats on violence against officers are sobering. 40% reporting physical assaults in the past year. It underscores the risks. And the use of force pepper spray, restraints while sometimes seen as necessary, often just escalates tensions further, creates a more volatile situation for everyone.
That video leak from Sing Sing in 2024 showing guards apparently using excessive force, that really brought this tension into the public eye, didn't it? Sparked a lot of outrage. It's a stark reminder of the power dynamics and the potential for abuse.
Precisely. For inmates, it reinforces that sense of powerlessness. For officers, the constant stress, the exposure to violence, it leads to that burnout, the PTSD we mentioned. It's a cycle that seems incredibly hard to break without real systemic change.
And beyond the routines, the interactions, there's this deeper psychological wear and tear, right? This erosion of identity, of dignity, living under constant surveillance, the strip searches, zero privacy. It has to grind away at your sense of self-worth.
Yeah, and there's this concept of institutionalization. That APA study suggested a big percentage of long-term max security inmates actually lose the ability to function independently outside. They get so used to the controlled environment, they struggle with basic decisions upon release.
It shows up as what sources call learned helplessness, this pervasive despair, hopelessness, and combine that with very limited access to things that might help rebuild agency education, counseling, and it creates huge barriers to positive change.
Right. Only a small fraction get access to education programs, again, largely due to underfunding, overcrowding, and counseling services, often long waiting lists, if they exist at all, leaving many to cope with trauma and mental health issues alone.
It's almost heartbreaking to hear that for the few who do get into these programs, the impact can be huge. That CDCR study, finding almost half said education helped them feel human again. That says so much about how dehumanizing the default experience must be.
It really does. And the sad reality is the scarcity of these resources denies so many the chance to grow, to address the issues that led them there, and ultimately to break those negative cycles when they leave.
Which brings us to another really critical piece, the isolation, the disconnection from the outside world. It seems like this just deepens the emotional and psychological toll we've been talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The main goal is security, sure, but the human cost of that isolation is immense. Severely restricted contact with family, with friends. It cuts off those vital support networks that are so crucial for well-being and eventually for successful reintegration.
The limits are really stark, aren't they? Like one 15-minute phone call a month, two non-contact visits, that's according to BJS guidelines for places like ADX Florence, and then add in monitored mail, delays, censorship. People can go months without meaningful contact.
And it's apparently much worse in maximum security compared to lower levels.
Mm.
That Prison Policy Initiative report found a much higher percentage in max security felt completely cut off.
That feeling, being completely cut off, it must be devastating, especially if you had strong family ties or if something major is happening outside a death in the family, a child's birthday. Not being able to participate, it just compounds the grief, the loss.
And the research backs this up. That UC Irvine study linked limited family contact directly to higher rates of depression, even suicide attempts. And for parents in prison, and that's a significant number, about 25% in max security according to BJS, the disconnection can cause real emotional and behavioral problems for their kids, sadly perpetuating cycles of trauma across generations.
Beyond just the lack of contact, there's that fundamental loss of freedom, of autonomy within the prison. It seems to breed this really deep despair.
Precisely. Having virtually zero control over your own life when you eat, sleep, move into it, it erodes your sense of self, your agency. That Vera Institute survey found 70% reported feeling like they were just stagnating.
And the constant surveillance, the dehumanizing treatment, being called by a number, maybe it's easy to see how identity gets stripped away, makes it incredibly hard to find meaning or purpose when meaningful activities are so scarce.
And there seems to be a clear link between that lack of hope and the high recidivism rates. BJS data suggest 55% of max security inmates reoffend within 3 years. If you feel you have no future, no real chance for change, it's tragically more likely you'll end up back inside. That quote from the former San Quentin inmate really sticks with you. You feel like you're nothing, just a body in a cage waiting for time to pass. It's hard to see a future when you're stuck in that.
Wow, yeah. It just hammers home the need for programs that foster purpose, that offer real pathways to rehabilitation, not just warehousing people.
And this isolation, this disconnection, it doesn't just harm the person inside, it ripples outwards, affecting families, communities, society as a whole.
Absolutely. The financial strain on families can be huge. We saw data suggesting 40% of households with an incarcerated member are below the poverty line, plus the cost of just staying in touch, expensive phone calls, travel for visits. It all adds up.
And we mentioned the kids earlier. Children of incarcerated parents face higher risks dropping out of school, even future incarceration themselves. It highlights how these cycles can span generations.
And for whole communities with high incarceration rates, it can lead to what researchers call concentrated disadvantage, destabilizing families, weakening the social fabric.
And the overall societal cost is just enormous, something like $80 billion annually in the U.S., according to the Prison Policy Initiative. For a system that, looking at recidivism, often fails to actually make communities safer in the long run. It really forces you to question if prioritizing punishment over rehabilitation is the most effective approach.
It certainly does. But, amidst all these really difficult, often disheartening facts, it is important to remember that change is possible. Our sources highlighted the story of Jamal Carter, a former inmate whose journey is a pretty powerful example of hope and resilience.
Jamal's story is really remarkable, yeah. He faced so many of the systemic issues we've discussed: poverty, gangs, lack of opportunity growing up in Chicago. These factors sadly played a role in his path to crime.
And his crime-armed robbery, a murder occurred, led to a life sentence in 2005. He was only 19. His own words about feeling he had no other options back then are just heartbreaking. He ended up in an Illinois maximum security facility, facing that world of violence and isolation.
His early years inside were about survival. He joined a gang for protection, which led to more violence. He was seriously stabbed in 2008. After that, 6 months in solitary. And that experience had a devastating impact on his mental health.
Yeah, he talked about hearing voices, hallucinations. It's a stark reminder of the psychological damage extreme isolation can inflict, and highlights the lack of mental health support in those situations.
The turning point, amazingly, was education. In 2012, he enrolled in a prison education program, earned his GED, started college courses. He found passions in literature, sociology. It gave him a new focus.
He said it gave him purpose, helped him confront his past, understand the bigger picture, the systemic factors. He mentioned reading about cycles of poverty and crime felt like reading his own story, and even limited counseling helped him process guilt, anger, start seeking redemption.
And then after 15 years, his sentence was commuted in 2020. Good behavior, advocacy efforts. Since release, he's dedicated his life to helping others still inside, founded a nonprofit providing educational resources to inmates. By 2024, it was in 3 Illinois prisons.
He even testified before the Illinois General Assembly in 2023. His testimony actually helped lead to increased funding for mental health services in prisons there. Got bipartisan support, remarkably. His quote really sums it up. I want to show that people can change, but they need a chance. Education, counseling, hope. Prisons shouldn't just punish, they should heal.
Jamal's journey just underscores so much, doesn't it? The power of resilience, the critical importance of rehabilitation. It shows the transformative potential of education, of counseling.
And it really challenges that purely punitive mindset, right? It highlights the need for compassionate reform, better mental health care, less solitary, real pathways to redemption. His life is just this powerful testament that change is possible even from the harshest places if people are treated with dignity and given support.
And Jamal's story, while inspiring, isn't just about one person. It really shines a light on the broader consequences of maximum security incarceration for individuals, families, and society. These consequences often fuel those negative cycles that reach far beyond the prison walls.
Definitely. For people coming out of max security, the scars can be deep. Studies show high rates of PTSD nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty socializing.
And reintegration is incredibly tough.
Yeah.
Huge barriers to finding jobs. And those high recidivism rates we mentioned, they sadly show the system often fails to prepare people for life outside. The long-term effects of things like solitary can make forming relationships, managing stress, incredibly difficult.
And that lack of access to education and counseling inside just limits their chances to build a different future, doesn't it? It's a huge human cost, a massive loss of potential.
And let's not forget the staff. Correctional officers working in these high-stress places face a huge emotional toll, too. Burnout, mental health issues like PTSD, even suicidal ideation, the rates are alarmingly high compared to the general population.
Yeah, the long hours, relatively low pay, often inadequate training, especially in things like de-escalation. It all adds up. Makes for an incredibly difficult, often dangerous work environment.
Which can, unfortunately, foster that culture of fear and mistrust we talked about, maybe leading to more reliance on force, escalating tensions. That high turnover rate for officers is just a clear sign that the situation is unsustainable for them, too.
And zooming out again, the impact on society is massive. The financial cost is staggering, billions spent annually. Yet the outcomes, like high recidivism, suggest the system isn't effectively rehabilitating people or making communities safer long term.
It feels like the focus on punishment, rather than addressing root causes, just perpetuates the problems. It drains resources that maybe could be better spent on prevention, education, community support, things that could tackle issues earlier.
And those communities hit hardest by incarceration get trapped in that cycle of concentrated disadvantage, destabilizing families, weakening social bonds, and the kids facing increased risks across the board.
Ultimately, there's a societal cost in how we view justice itself. If we just see these prisons as a necessary evil and don't push for evidence-based reforms, we're fundamentally failing to address the underlying issues that drive crime and failing to build genuinely safer, healthier communities for everyone.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's undeniably clear. Maximum security prisons are this incredibly complex knot of challenges. We've touched on severe overcrowding, the mental health crisis, chronic underfunding, pervasive violence, the deep effects of isolation, the loss of autonomy.
And it's so vital to remember the human cost, the cycle of trauma for inmates, the huge emotional toll on staff. Daily life inside often strips dignity and actively hinders real rehabilitation efforts.
And the impact ripples far beyond the walls, affecting families, communities, carrying a massive societal cost. It really highlights the limits of a system focused so heavily on punishment alone.
But as Jamal Carter's story showed us, hope exists. Transformation is possible. His journey underscores the vital role of rehabilitation through education, through counseling, and helping people turn their lives around.
And ultimately, this whole exploration really pushes for a fundamental shift, doesn't it? Away from just isolation and punishment towards prioritizing rehabilitation and successful reintegration. That means more funding for mental health, education, staff training, policies to reduce overcrowding, reduce the use of
Right.
solitary.
Challenges are huge, no doubt,
Yeah.
but so is the potential for positive change. Nelson Mandela's words really resonate here about judging a nation not by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest. It's a powerful thought to hold on to.
So, as you think about everything we've covered today, about these often hidden realities, we leave you with a couple of questions. What are your own thoughts, your reactions? Do you believe meaningful, lasting reform in these institutions is truly possible? We genuinely love to hear your perspectives. Please feel free to share your comments below. And if you want to explore the criminal justice system further, check out our next deep dive. We'll be looking at the impact of incarceration on families and communities. Thanks so much for joining us for this important conversation. And please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the issues shaping our world.